Hello, everyone. Welcome to Advancing Access to Entrepreneurship and Enabling an Inclusive Startup Ecosystem. We are so excited to get into this conversation today. We're going to be diving into the topic of entrepreneurship as riskier and historically less accessible to entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds, including people with disabilities, Black, Latinx, Native American, LGBTQ, and other underrepresented founders. Meanwhile, research consistently shows that diverse leadership relates to entrepreneurial success. How can organizations, companies, and founders find ways to increase access to all entrepreneurs, enabling an inclusive startup ecosystem? So, I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. My name is Shireen Hafeez, and I am the founder of the national outreach nonprofit organization called Deaf Kids Code. So, our mission is about promoting computing, computer science, technology, and design thinking skills to students who are deaf and hard of hearing. This population historically suffers from over a 70% unemployment or underemployment um, disparity. And our mission is to bridge the wealth gap. But we believe that the digital age is the great equalizer. And as long as we harness this population that is already born into the digital age, there is no reason for us not to be able to cultivate deaf talent and for all of us to be able to benefit from that talent. So I'm going to introduce our next co-panelists.
Hi, everybody. My name is Gil Addo. I'm thrilled to be here to share with you guys. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called RubiconMD. We're a 7-year-old digital health company on a mission to democratize access to medical expertise. We do that by enabling a connection between primary care clinicians and a network of specialists that we curate across the country who provide their expertise through what we call e-consults. The opinions come back in a couple hours, and we found that half the time they enable a better interaction while reducing the need to go send people out to specialists. We're based in New York. We support clinicians across 37 states across the country. We're a venture-backed business. We've raised a little over $40 million to date. Thrilled to be here and be able to share with you guys.
All right, thanks, Gil. I am Jerrod Hill. I am part of AWS. In particular, I'm on the venture capital BD team. So in my role, I work with venture capital funds in the New York area and then work with their startups to access resources at Amazon and at AWS. So anything from free credits or different services or introductions or helping them with go-to-market or technical assistance or anything just related to the startup ecosystem, we try to work with them on. And so I've been here now at Amazon for a little over 2.5 years. And I've been working with startups in our venture capital BD team ever since. And so looking forward to working with everyone and learning more and then discussing more about what we're doing today.
Great. And my pronouns are she and her. Jerrod, what are yours?
Yeah, my pronouns are he and him.
My pronouns are he and him as well.
Excellent. Okay. Well, starting off with our first question, and this will be directed to Jerrod and then Gil, is why is community building important to you? And what is the power in being part of an inclusive ecosystem?
Yeah, thanks, Shireen, for that. So it's interesting. I talk to a lot of startups and inevitably a lot of investors in my role. So currently, over the last 2.5 years, I've worked with probably 500 plus investors and have worked with, again, 1,000 plus startups. And what you understand and realize is that people are looking for, one, people that look like them, people that talk like them, people that come from their background. And when you don't have that, sometimes that absence is very difficult for startup founders, for individuals trying to start up a company, for individuals that are in traditional companies to really feel involved and included in an environment. And so I think especially when you talk about certain roles where you have a CEO, and if you're the only LGBTQ CEO that you know, how do you have someone who actually understands some of the different types of battles that you'll have within your own ecosystem, your own startup, if that's again as an investor or as a startup or as a founder or someone who's just in the tech ecosystem. And so finding your space and finding your people is very important. And then when you find those people in that space, again, you can feel involved. I think to your question around community, right? One side of it is building community, and the other side is being included in that community. And so I think a good example of that, if people have seen the photograph of like equity versus equality, and there's kind of the three boxes, and you have three kids, and then you have one kid who can see with the box because he's tall, but another kid that has the same exact size box that can't see over the fence, right? And then when you talk about equity, each of them gets the size of box to allow them to see over the fence. And then the last example is when you think of inclusion, now you remove the fence and allow those same kids to actually play in the game. So how can we get to the point where now each of these students or founders or individuals are getting the resources they need to be successful, right? Because each person needs a different thing. And then now after we've given them that, how can we make sure that they're again in the company, in the game, in their community? So in looking at both pieces, I think it's really important that we recognize that people have differences, and then how can we help them find those differences? And even if those individuals are different, how can we still make sure they feel involved? So again, the community piece I think is just really important. And sometimes I think that piece is, I won't say undervalued, but individuals don't understand how other people who may have a difference of, again, opinion, of background, of race, of sexual orientation may feel when they are in a certain majority community and how they may be missed in some ways.
How would you say equity impacted your own journey or your current role?
Yeah, so I think in particular in my role, and especially in tech, where you've seen that the majority of large tech companies don't have a lot of individuals that are black or minority. When you look at a lot of VC funds, they don't have a lot of individuals that are deploying capital that are black or minority. The number is less than 2% of VC funds have individuals that are black, less than 1% Latino. And then if you look at the level of partner, even less. And then we look at startups, we can talk about startup CEOs and founders, there aren't that many of them as well. And so in my role, I've noticed that and wanted to make sure we made a concerted effort at AWS and in my role to make sure that these groups that, again, are small are very important. And so how can we make sure that we're emphasizing the need that they are emphasizing and understand the need that they do have, and then making sure that we're helping them execute on their goal and vision, and they're not getting lost in the cracks. So particularly in my role, I help a lot with making sure that we target underrepresented founders and make sure we're assisting them work with VC funds that actually invest in underrepresented founders. And then as we think about our community at AWS and Amazon, how do we make sure we bring the resources internally and then also externally to make sure that we support those founders?
Very nice that you mentioned the intersectionality. Gil?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. Community, I think about it in two ways. So one, I think Jerrod kind of spoke about kind of the inclusivity. And so, entrepreneurship is a team sport. And so you do need to feel included. And the best companies are built really with DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion at their core. And so people feeling not just that they, got an opportunity in there, but that they're really valued and that their perspective is actually relevant and helpful to kind of build a great product and build a great organization. And so I think like for better or worse, companies that are doing that right now are going to do better and are going to win versus other companies that are being built without that at its core. I actually don't, I hope that's not the case because I hope every company really builds with that at its core and can build great products and great organizations. So I think that's one element of it that's really important. The other element is when you just think about what community means writ large in entrepreneurship, that really means the network also, and being able to have a network that you can tap into, right? Your network is currency. Can you reach out to people who can turn into introductions for fundraising, for clients, for potential senior hires? All of those, that's what you need to grow the business. And so having that network and being able to tap into those people is how you actually, grow the business. And so historically, underrepresented groups, underrepresented minorities, Black, Latinx, other disabled, groups, LGBTQ, like they have been left behind and have not been included in the creation of those networks for a lot of reasons that are somewhat simple and obvious, right?
How would you say that equity impacted your own journey or your current role?
Yeah. Well, I don't come from, means. And so I think of, what we've built with RubiconMD as really a fortunate opportunity to be able to take that risk. And I realize that a lot of people in my position and with my background aren't always given that opportunity. So I think of it just, fundamentally the ability to be able to leave a good paying job and to take on the risk of starting a business that about something you care about and are passionate about is something that's very difficult, and it's very difficult for people, particularly who don't have kind of the backstop of any type of a safety net if you fall. And so I think that's a hard thing, and I think that that's part of what you see with underrepresented groups. So my own personal story, I wanted to start my business out of business school, and maybe would have even started sooner, but I had loans and financial challenge, and I didn't really have the same kind of flexibility from a family perspective to feel like I could take that risk, even though I was pretty young. And so I think that kind of held me back initially. Obviously, I was able to leave and still start the business, but I think I've always had that and that understanding of what a privilege it is to be able to take that risk, and it's always kind of been in the background for me. And I think that it's actually quite ironic when you think about it, because what it takes to actually build a business is this grit and this determination and this ability to kind of operate with a chip on your shoulder and a willingness to run through walls. Like that's what it takes to really, that's what entrepreneurship is. And the best people to do that are people who've been training their entire life because they come from underrepresented backgrounds where they've been marginalized.
I love that because I always say that who is the best problem solver than the person growing up in an inaccessible uh, environment, and I agree with you 100% that, not having the bandwidth to take a risk, because you're already living day to day, uh, that in itself prohibits so much. But I also often say to, companies that we collaborate with that you can't just throw money at a problem. Throwing money at a problem is not simply going to resolve an issue. But, you know, Jerrod, this is to you, and then we'll go to Gil. Is that do you believe that more venture funds, to for investment, do you think that in this space it would fix the problem?
That's a great question. And I think, especially in this ecosystem where you see a lot of venture capital funds being formed that focus on underrepresented founders. So, if that's, again, women, LGBTQ, Latinx, Black founders, will that change the game? Will that move the needle for us to get more companies that are building companies that can be venture backable? I think it's an interesting question because every company doesn't necessarily need venture funding. And so there needs to be in my opinion, an expansion of the types of fundings that we can even give startups so that when they get that funding, it could be for a barbershop or a laundromat. It could be for a high scale tech company. But as of right now, these founders and these startups and individuals have different ideas that, again, like I said, some are venture backable, some are not. But how can we make sure they're getting capital so that even if they build a $10 million business, that's a really great business. If they build a $100 million business, that's a great business. But the needs for those change. So going back to your question, if we have kind of more Black or underrepresented founders who are in the VC space, will that help? It'll help some, and it'll move the needle some. But inevitably, every VC functions similar to all other VCs. So they have to get companies that will eventually become billion-dollar companies. They have to, again, have certain board seats and certain controls. And so with that, if a startup's company can't hit that, then that VC inevitably can't invest in that company. So I think that dynamic is really important. And I think one thing that's really interesting is there are different models of income, or it's not income, but investing and funding that are starting to come into the ecosystem. So more angel funds that can invest in early stage companies. There is more funding, like for example, revenue-based investments, which if you're making revenues now, they'll give you an investment in your company. So again, for founders, it's more than just, okay, let's look and see if there's more VCs in the world, as much as there are additional banks that can provide money and other areas and resources that we can get to make sure that startup founders are getting capitalized, right? And I think sometimes we think in the traditional sense, like, oh, a startup. Oh, I think of Facebook, right? It's great. Mark Zuckerberg is super smart, and he built a company that became a $30 billion business. But again, there's 60 million millionaires in the US, and the majority of them aren't Mark Zuckerberg. The majority of them have built companies that took grit and that took finance and that took money, and were able to build that into something that was really big. I think one of the best examples are, again, examples of like dry cleaners and laundromats, where even John Henry, who was originally with Harlem Capital and now is doing some different stuff, that's how he started. He started off in the dry cleaning, washing business, where he was able to then sell that company and then start an accelerator to then fund Black founders in Harlem. So there's a lot of ways, I think, to get to the end goal, which is building great companies, doing things you're passionate about, and then in building wealth. And then VC is one route, but then we also need to expand that to other routes as well.
Okay, so then do you think that companies struggle to admit that they have a problem with equity?
So it's interesting. I think that companies do struggle with admitting they have a problem with it. I think part of it is just like any human trait, I guess, right? People just have an issue admitting their faults, right? It's like, oh, maybe I'm just not good at math and I don't want to talk about the math part because I can't figure out how to fix it. And I think for a lot of large tech companies and a lot of companies in general, if that's small or big, it's, oh, we know there's a problem. We haven't figured out a solution to fix it. We're trying to throw money at it. We're trying to hire a diversity lead, but we still can't move the needle on the numbers. And I think sometimes we don't admit that this is a larger problem that we also have to work through that isn't solely on the backs of big tech and startups and these companies as much as it is for them to provide access. But how do we get more students in STEM? How do we get more people access to the right interviews? How do we give them different channels to understand how they can either be a coder if they don't come from that background? How do we just provide, I think, to the point of this conversation around access, right? How do we provide folks access to be able to get into these places where traditionally may not have been? How do we remove that veil around the ecosystem where it's like, oh, all you have to do is go to a venture capital fund startup, or not their startup, their website, and you can see all their startups that have like open roles, right? And different ways for people to think, oh, I don't necessarily just have to go to, Indeed or LinkedIn to find the perfect company as much as you can go to other resources. And then once you get there, maybe now you can go and start your own thing, right? And so I think that is interesting, again, around the concept of equity of, okay, how do we help bigger and smaller companies do that? And how do we think of that even more expensive? I guess, especially given kind of my background in teaching and education and seeing startups or not startups, students struggle in certain areas, how do we supplement them early on so that they're prepared to be the engineers of tomorrow, right? So how do we start, especially really early? I think people underestimate how early the gap starts when you talk about either if it's reading or writing or math or computer science and access. And we don't get access when you're 4 years old, when you don't get access when you're 6 years old, when you don't get access when you're 10 years old. Eventually, when you're 18 years old, now you have a huge hurdle that you have to get through. So how are we making sure that we're going early? You want to provide that access for students and people who want to be future business owners and founders of companies. How do we help supplement them if they're older and haven't been able to get that? And then once we get into kind of the workspace, how do we help companies find that talent and provide access for people who want to get into that space? So definitely a big problem and a lot of stakeholders who have to help figure that out.
Gil, you're the founder of a company. What are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah. Well, first, I agree with everything said, but I think there's another reason um, why we need more money into venture. And I don't know that it's an absolute dollar amount, but it's really the people who are funding venture. We all have biases. We all have kind of blind spots. I remember hearing some of the early stories of businesses. When I talk to founders of Rent the Runway and business like that, where those are huge businesses. They're great businesses, and they struggle to get funding because the people that write the checks couldn't understand the problem. And I was talking to a Black female founder, and I was like, let me make some introductions because I think your business is incredible. I sent it to a couple of our folks, and they just kind of saw what she was working on, which is targeted at Black women's health, as a niche market, and it's a pretty large niche market. But it's not. I'm not faulting at all the investors because they don't understand that market. They can do some homework, they can get educated, but what you also need is more investors. You need investors that look like her. You need investors that understand that problem, that see that opportunity, and can deploy capital to partner with her. And so there are people like that. There are great. But I think you need to have a representative ecosystem of capital, not so much because we need a lot more dollars, but because we need a lot more people moving large amounts of capital who can understand some of these problems, and who can see the opportunities where other investors have blind spots, which, yeah, through training and bias, they can start to understand and they can start to study and understand the market. But you fundamentally need people who are going to believe, who are going to see, who can understand it in a different way. And so I think that's why the just shape and the color and the whole the venture capital industry, I think, needs to add that. I work in healthcare, which you just have to understand healthcare to some extent. But even so, like we deal in communities that you still have to understand, and you have to be able to build a bridge to those communities. And so it's also necessary in our company to have people who can understand the communities that we're working in, and who can help us to go in and have a great degree of empathy for the clinicians who are then supporting those communities, many of which are communities of color, and all of which have issues around chronic conditions and the like. So I think it's really having the investor community that can also reflect broader population to be able to address some of these problems that historically venture has missed.
So you're saying that it has to be a harmonious combination of having the right investors that relate on some level to the community that you're trying to help elevate. And but do you have a real world example from your own experience? I mean, I know that your company comes from a very deeply personal place, but but as an individual that is historically underrepresented, do you have an example or an anecdote that you can share with the rest of us?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, we've raised a lot of money from with through a lot of rounds of financing, and so it's not easy to fundraise. It's also it, the access to capital is even more limited for founders of color, and so there have been situations where we've been in rooms. And it's not really, there are plenty of situations where people just didn't believe in our business, which is, I think, what you're comfortable with because that's the way the industry works. But I think there's plenty of situations where people didn't believe that we could build this business.
See, I always say that who is the ultimate subject matter expert in the problem than the individual. Jerrod, you're in an interesting position, right? Because you are from the VC side, but you also have the insider outsider perspective, which actually makes you a very valuable asset in supporting, potential founders out there that could be listening in on this. I'm just curious that you have obviously been in this space for a good amount of time and good amount of experience. Do you have any examples, any personal experience that you can share of obstacles that you've seen others face and how you were able to harness, support from your own position?
So well, that's a good question. I think that in terms of the battles I've seen people face, it's pretty interesting. Like I talked to one founder, or not, yeah, founder now VC named Brian. He's at Lightship Capital, and when he was first raising the funding for his company, I believe he talked to 150 investors before he got the first checks for his company. And so you see that for some people, like the fundraising process, they could talk to 10 founder or VCs, right? And then immediately they have to check, or it could be just from if you go with the old napkin or even a light presentation, or oh, they know that person and they think they're smart. If you think back to examples like Instagram, where Kevin was able to raise 250 just from being in the ecosystem and knowing a few people. And I think that access isn't always with the founders that we have. And so when you think about, again, Black, Latinx, LGBTQ founders, um, founders that have issues or ability issues, it just becomes really hard. Because I think, one, you have to deal with your own issues that you're facing and having to battle over that. And you have to deal with the level of access to different networks that you may not have. And so how can you battle through that? And now, if you have an idea that doesn't sit within the traditional space of what a VC or a venture fund wants to invest in, now you have to go talk to 150 investors. It makes it really difficult for founders to do well. And then if you look on the other side, right on the investor side, it's really hard to get into the venture space.
So then what would be, if you were to have any takeaway, what would be advice that you would give? And I'll start with Gil first and then come back to Jerrod.
Well, I guess what would be, I'm going to turn it around and interview you, Shireen, first. Is, you were able to kind of see a problem that others didn't see, and you were able to build something around it, maybe not taking traditional sources of capital, but to really solve a real problem. I mean, what would be your advice to people?
As a founder, I always say that that you're doing something right when the belief in what you're building or creating, you fundamentally believe that it has a place in this world and it must be here. So that's where the grit comes from, because the grit is an emotional condition, right? That's going to get you through to, as Gil said, have the chip on the shoulder and, run into walls or bash walls or whatever it's going to take, right? And because you're going to get so many no's and you have to persevere. So your belief in what you're doing has to be more than non-believers. So it's more important to have believers in your arena than it is to have just funding, because funding has great limitations if you're not around the right support system. It can't be a one-person show. And and so that is really fundamentally the starting point for any founder that's out there listening, is it what you're building or creating? Do you fundamentally believe that it has a place in this world and it should exist? And but of course my mission is a very emotional mission. It's a very personal mission, as is, I would like to believe many founders out there that are living in communities that are facing obstacles, and and they have this incredible solution. So that in itself is the catalyst for greatness, is that. Jerrod, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I guess if we go back to the title, which is what advancing inclusion and access to entrepreneurship, I think one thing that Gil touched on earlier, I think that is really important, is around like your network, right? And the currency that is your network, and being able to have that access and being able to reach out to people and get assistance and help when you need it, to be able to reach out to people and actually get capital, I think is really important. And I think sometimes we undervalue the importance of that notion a lot of ways, or in a lot of ways. And so how do before you're a founder, how do you make sure you're building and cultivating a community and a network that when you eventually at some point need them, you'll be able to then reach out to them, right? And I think sometimes we get stuck in our own networks. Oh, I'll just reach out to people that I went to school with. I'll just reach out to people that I work with. But even things like Twitter, right, where now if you're interested in a certain space, you can go message someone and tweet with them and have a conversation about a certain topic that maybe in 5-10 years ago, you couldn't have that level of access. If you look at Clubroom, for example, right now you can go in and listen to conversations of individuals talking. You can join those conversations. You can create your own conversations, and then people can join in and you can build your network. LinkedIn is another example where you can, again, use that to cultivate relationships with people, meetups, drinks, events, just so many ways I think that people can gain that access to a community they traditionally haven't had, and then use that community and then take them to the next level. And that next level may just be some mentorship and advice. That next level may be I'm trying to raise a fund. That next level may be I want you to be at a speaking event. The next level could be a lot of things. And so if I had one thing for folks to take away, is that when you call, hopefully people pick up. And And I'm part of the Wharton Club in New York. I'm one of the executive members on the um, for the club. And one thing we always talk about is take the call. And so you want to, when at that point that you reach out to people, that they'll take the call that you reach out to them with. So that'd be my advice for founders, individuals, anyone that's listening here.
Very nice. Gil?
Yeah. I'll give a few things that I think are important. So, I think one, to your point, Shireen, solve a real problem. And so I think anybody that's building a business, you need to solve a real problem. And you need to have this skill, which isn't really something that you can teach, but it's something everybody, I think, innately understands, where you have to have this belief and, kind of put blinders and believe you're solving something real, and kind of put, filter out the doubters and the noise. And yet you still have to be listening very acutely to the market and be very, very aware and understand how to tweak and, navigate, to be able to get to the real, solution to the problem. So you have to be able to do both. And so I think it's really important that you do that, and that you think about how people can help you through that. And then the other thing I would say, just on the network and kind of growing a business, um, the best way to build your network is to figure out how you can help other people. And when you start to grow the network, and grow your network, being able to cultivate it by bridging gaps between where you see problems and where you see people who can help them. I think you should, to Jerrod's point, to always take the call, and that's how you get people to take the call for you, is really thinking there's a pay it forward mentality as well. But I think even beyond that, people think about their network as something they hold tight to. You should be looking to be able to make connections between people and expand and use your network to help others, because at the end of the day, it actually helps to cultivate your network as well. So I think people should also be thinking about ways that they can build their own network, because that's, at the end of the day, you need employees, you need capital, you need actual clients, and you need people who are going to kind of believe in you and promote you. And so all of those things come through in cultivating a network.
Excellent. Well, um, that's so spot on, and all of it matters. So it's not even a one layered solution, it's a multi-layered solution. And this is what this conversation was about today. So if there are any other thoughts, I think we have concluded today's conversation, and it was brilliant, and it was an honor to uh, have both of you joining me today. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Yeah, thank you as well for hosting. And for the audience, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or any thoughts as well.
Yeah. Any contact information you'd like to share?
Yeah, so individuals, if you're interested, you can just email me at hiljerro@amazon.com, or you can find me on Twitter at Jerrod M. Hill, and then shoot me a tweet.
You can find me at Gil Addo, Giladdo, at Twitter, and you can email me as well, Gil@RubiconMD.com.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.